Hello, everybody, and welcome back to CoMotion Labs Fundamentals for Startups Hardware Edition. This is our very last hardware fundamentals for the year, and I am as happy that you joined us as I am sad to wrap up this series. I am Brady Ryan, CoMotion Labs Hardware Manager. If you've joined us before, you've heard this spiel, and you know that CoMotion Labs is the University of Washington's effort around startup incubation. We operate 3 incubators here on campus, one for hardware, one for life sciences, and one for software. We don't take equity in our startups, and we don't take any IP. We just want to help our startups succeed. Here in the hardware incubator, we have a lot of 3D printing, including resin and FDM. We have a circuitry and soldering setup, reflow oven, CNC, laser cutter, tons of tools. We're adding a injection molder and a vinyl cutter, and possibly a vacuum former. So we're always adding new tools for our members to use. We also have relationships across campus with machine shops and the 3D printing shop. So if we don't have the capabilities you need, we probably know somebody who does. We also recently installed a 5G network in our space with millimeter wave, ultra wideband, and narrowband 5G. So we're ready to work with startups innovating in the 5G space, anyone doing advanced sensors and more. We have one bench available for new startups, so give me a shout if you're looking for a place to host your startup. While we wait a couple minutes for everyone to join us, I'll make a few announcements. This is the last event of our spring series. We'll take a break over the summer and resume in the fall. All of our fundamentals for startups presentations are archived on our CoMotion website under innovation training videos. We've covered a ton of topics over the last several years, so feel free to take a look if you've got some free time. We have a full schedule available on our website where you can register for events like these. So please visit our website, comotionlabs.com, and click on the fundamentals link. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell. And Fundamentals for Startups is funded in part by a grant from the EDA, and we'll be dropping a link in the chat to a quick survey. That just tells us who you are and where you're from and helps keep the EDA happy. We also have a special guest here today. Macy McGovern is here from Creative Destruction Lab to announce a new program that's super relevant to our attendees here today. CDL is a fantastic organization, and I'm thrilled that they're deciding to focus next on advanced manufacturing. Macy?
Thanks, Brady. Hi, everyone. My name is Macy McGovern, and as Brady said, I'm a venture manager with Creative Destruction Lab. We are a startup mentorship program based out of the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington, specifically focused on helping startups from the pre-seed up to Series A stage. As of yesterday, we announced that this next year we will be launching a cohort of 20 to 25 startups who can participate for mentorship related to advanced manufacturing technologies. So anywhere from machine intelligence to industrial IoT, robotics, sensors, 3D printing, a completely free equity-wise as well as fee-wise, and as well as CoMotion, we don't take any IP in the startups that we support. So if you think you might be interested in getting mentorship related to these areas from people who have successfully created and exited companies in these areas, as well as local venture capitalists focused on investing in these technologies, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via LinkedIn or macy.mcgovern@creativedestructionlab.com. Thank you, and back to you, Brady.
Thanks, Macy. CDL really is a world-class organization. I can't recommend them enough for anybody who might be a fit. Do a little bit of research, and I hope you guys out there apply. Today, Jim Brizomitsas is here to present 5G fundamentals for entrepreneurs. Jim has over 23 years of enterprise channel and startup experience through companies such as Bell Canada, Nortel Networks, PeopleSoft, Oracle, and Microsoft. Jim is the founder of the 5G Open Innovation Lab in Seattle, a community partnership of private and public sponsors focused on discovering, accelerating, and promoting future connectivity, edge computing, and artificial intelligence-inspired technologies. Prior to launching the lab, Jim was a managing partner for Quake Capital, leading their early efforts to establish a presence in the ecosystem. Jim was also the general manager of Microsoft for Startups program in the US and Canada. His team was responsible for startup engagements, partnering with leading North American startup accelerators and incubators. Together with these partners, Jim's team engaged over 2,800 startups actively running on Azure through programs, technical enablement, and events to help startups accelerate their business. Prior to launching Microsoft for Startups program, Jim led operations for Microsoft Ventures globally, in addition to creating and launching their HiPo program, an exclusive engagement for startups with significant market potential. Jim will take questions via the YouTube chat, so feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and I will hand the event over to Jim.
Thank you, Brady, and thank you for this opportunity to present today. I really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Brizomitsas. As Brady said, I'm the founder of the 5G Open Innovation Lab, and today I'm going to act as your friendly antagonist. I'm going to talk a little bit about what 5G is and what 5G isn't, and hopefully impart some of our experiences to you all. As Brady mentioned, we're happy to take questions throughout today's session. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Brady will interrupt and we'll go ahead and answer those questions as we go along. So let's talk a little bit about 5G. 5G is mostly here. You're probably all carrying or on path to be carrying a 5G phone. And if you did, you can do a speed test just like I did a couple of weeks back. And as you'll see on my phone, and I'm using T-Mobile's 5G, I'm getting up to about 400 megs down, and depends on what areas. In some areas, I'm actually getting quite high. I've gotten over a gig in some areas, and in some areas I'm getting quite low. So the reality is that 5G is here, but it's really not here entirely. And there's something in industry called standalone 5G, and that is when an operator is a completely full 5G system from its G Node B, the Evolved Packet Core, right up to the RAN technologies as well. And we're not there entirely. And in fact, when I looked over at Ookla's speed test, and I just did this yesterday, to kind of see where mobile sits across every country, you can see here in the United States, we're actually not listed in the top 20. United States, as of yesterday, was ranked number 23. So that means that all of the carriers around the world are at various stages of deploying fully standalone 5G. It's on its way here. And just like we saw with 4G LTE, it's going to be about a 10 to 15 year journey. Not that long to set up the networks and run them and operate them, but certainly until we see the next generation standards of wireless, which will be called 6G. By the way, 5G is an iteration of standards sanctioned through 3GP processes and is very analysis to what 4G was, 3G, 2G, 1G, and we'll go through a little bit about that. And of course, what's to come in 6G as well. So we're kind of here with 5G, and it's just only going to get better from a consumer standpoint. But now let's start to take a look at why 5G is better. And that's something that I get asked quite a bit. Now, I'm never going to profess to be a 5G expert. I'm an accidental hobbyist around 5G and actually saw the potential for it. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation today. So much so that I wanted to create a software ecosystem around it. But at the fundamental layers, if you compare 5G to the mainstay of 4G LTE today, what is still pretty predominant from a wireless perspective, you'll see that the network operations are just fundamentally better across the board. The way we like to think of 5G is that the bandwidth pipe and its capabilities are far greater in scale than what we are capable of today with 4G LTE. So peak speeds, if you're doing carrier aggregation with 4G LTE in some markets, it's possible to get over a gig per second in speeds and downloads. With 5G, it is forecasted to get up to 10 gigabytes. And as I mentioned, if you go to certain areas, for instance, T-Mobile's network area around T-Mobile Park, it's not uncommon to get about 2 gigs worth of service on that. So we're really very much on the way there. The other thing we look at is latency performance, the amount of time it takes for a data packet to be sent and received back. And that's really important when you start thinking about use cases that have any sort of autonomous capability, or use cases like flying drones and such, where you really need to have very, very low latency performance for the safe operations of those devices. And in 4G world, we had somewhere between 40 to 50 milliseconds. To the human perception, that's actually still relatively quick, but it's not from a networking perspective. And so with 5G, we are expecting less than 10 milliseconds. And in some discussions and circles that I've been part of, I think there's a ubiquitous goal to try to get to something lower than that even. Scale is really important. And this is where I really started to get super excited. So as you're out walking around the neighborhood and you see cell poles around the neighborhood, those poles today, if they're running 4G RAN equipment, are capable of about 10 to 100,000 concurrent connections in a given area. In 5G, that same radio now has the ability to connect over 1 million devices. And that's really important, because what 5G is going to do that 4G can't do is rapidly scale the amount of devices and provide the network performance that 4G is not capable of. And the best analogy to demonstrate how 4G was fundamentally transformative to 3G was, if you remember back in the day of 3G, we were barely able to load websites, let alone run a video. In 4G LTE, not only are we running loading websites much quicker, but we're primarily using it for video consumption when we're away from Wi-Fi. And so this is very, very important. The scale of 5G networks is fundamentally significantly larger than where we are today with 4G. And then finally, when you look at the amount of data that the network is able to ingest and transport, that's actually quite exciting as well. From a 4G LTE perspective, these networks are really not that capable of moving vast amounts of data, but 1/100th of a terabyte per square kilometer. In the 5G world, that blows up to being over 10 terabytes. I'll show you a video where we actually show one of the use cases in action today, and you'll start to see some of this picture really come to life. Now, when you look at across all of the metrics, and of course there's more, we haven't talked about jitter or any other metrics around performance of the network. The new standards in 5G have really evolved to enable a set of scenarios that as developers, you could really take advantage of what these networks enable. Now, the path to 5G means a lot of new things as well. If you've been following the news on 5G, you've probably heard a lot about millimeter wave. To get to these higher speeds, you're going to be moving into higher spectrum bands. Now, carriers like T-Mobile have done really impressive things with their mid and low band spectrums. In 5G, the ability to stitch all of those various spectrum bands from low, mid to high together actually allows you to do a lot more speed and performance and such. But that means you're now deploying in certain areas a lot more densification of the network as well. And those millimeter wave RANs today are going to be needed to be deployed in scale. In some of those millimeter, actually all of the millimeter spectrum isn't possible to go through glass or concrete. And so you'll have to densify the network even more. We're not seeing that just yet, but as more and more 5G network deployments start to happen, you'll start to see more of those radios out in the public sphere. The other thing I talked about was the ability to connect to a number of new devices. According to the GSMA, who hosts Mobile World Congress, there's going to be somewhere between 24 to 26 billion IoT devices connected in the world today. As a measure of relevance, there's about 9 billion mobile subscribers, or sorry, 6 billion mobile subscribers in the world today. So the ability now to connect a plethora of new IoT devices in the 5G world is immense. And not only are you connecting those devices, but those devices are creating important data. And that is what excites me about the possibility of 5G. Now, 5G is also introducing a new set of network functions. We call these functions like network slicing or beamforming or carrier aggregation. These are essentially applications that can sit on top of the network that allow carriers to provide different qualities of service depending on whatever the use cases demand for. So imagine, if you will, an automotive OEM wants to have a dedicated slice of a network just for their vehicles to connect into that has a certain level of quality of service. In the 4G LTE world, that was kind of possible. In 5G, it's baked into the standards, and we're starting to see technology making that truly possible. Not able to do that. I like to think of it as programmable networking. The other piece of this opportunity in 5G, and this is a really interesting bifurcation, is private enterprise networking. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth, but this is essentially enterprise companies that are looking at the limitations afforded to them through Wi-Fi and exploring the use of cellular. So name your favorite enterprise. Could be a Starbucks here in the Seattle area looking at deploying private 5G connectivity at its warehouses or its roasting plants or wherever, and operating that solely on their own, very much in context to how they would have done it with Wi-Fi, but now they're using cellular. And the private enterprise market for 5G is exploding. And the last report that I saw suggests that the CAGR is growing at 48% year over year. So a lot of really interesting opportunities that are happening in cellular generally, and in 5G, there's new market opportunities that are growing. Now, what's
Jim,
really important? Yeah.
I asked something. So on that last slide, I think so. Jim and I have had several conversations where Jim tries really hard to teach me how 5G works, and he is very good at it. But I'm slow. And for me, the big thing that started to make 5G make more sense to me was, as a consumer, this is what 4G was. It was about my phone. Right. And 5G, it's not about consumer cell phones. It benefits consumers on their cell phones, but this amount of data, this sort of latency, this sort of scale, that's about enterprise. Is that more or less correct, Jim?
Yeah, yes, very much so. I'd like to say I'm probably not the most popular in the telecom world for suggesting that really the biggest opportunities in the enterprise world, but in the reality, as far as I could see, it is. There's been some studies, Brady, that have looked at the elasticity rather of demand from consumers from upgrading from a 4G LTE plan to a 5G plan, and is there elasticity there? Are consumers willing to spend more money? And it's not at all settled at the world level, but the early indications are suggesting that, hey, 5G is sort of expected as a baseline service anyways, and the appetite for consumers to want to spend more for 5G services is quite low. Again, that full experience has not played out yet. It could turn out that people are willing to spend for higher levels of speed and other performance afforded by 5G, but in the early innings, it doesn't suggest that is. Now, when you move it over to the enterprise context, that's a totally different story. And that's where I think the biggest benefactor of 5G is going to be the enterprise by far, in my opinion. And so when you look under the covers, and this is why I think the enterprise is really going to be the biggest benefactors. When you look under the covers, from where we started in 1G to 2G to 3G, 4G, those were essentially behind the scenes, how your network connected to those your phone connected to those networks. Those networks were essentially monolithic, purpose-built architectures. They were there to connect devices, authenticate devices, and deliver services like voice in the early days. And then it went to voice and data in the 3G and 4G worlds. Now, the standards for 5G are really dictating more of a cloud native implementation. Now, there's been some virtualization in the 4G LTE world where some elements of the network architecture have been virtualized. And so if you've been following this world, you may have seen some virtualization of the EPC core or vRAN functions as well, virtual network functions. In 5G, there is a much bigger push to cloud native rollouts of these networks, meaning not everything is, let me take a step back. It's not just about virtualization, it's actually moving towards containerized architectures. And that's really important because as these networks continue to grow and the scale for which they can connect to devices and move data continues to evolve, carriers are going to want more and more control of their network. And in some cases, they're going to want to automate some aspects of their network as well. When you move to a more open system and a cloud native system, now you're turning everything we've learned about in hyperscale computing at the cloud level, and you're bringing those principles into the network layer. And that starts to become super, super interesting, not just for operating these networks, but it becomes really interesting with what you could do with those networks. In parallel to that, and completely unrelated, in my time at Microsoft and helping to drive the Microsoft motion with startups, I had seen that startups were moving away from building applications that ran inside traditional virtual machines to re-architecting or architecting from the get-go their applications to be componentized, again, using containerization as an approach. Well, if a carrier is moving to containerization for operating and orchestrating their network, and the cloud is already into the containerization world as well, and app builders are doing the same, well, to a carrier, your network could be really, really valuable, not just because of the connectivity, but because you could probably use the real estate of your network to help enable edge applications as well. And the edge is going to be a big, big market for some of the use cases that I just shared earlier and others that we'll explore as well. So I started getting really excited about that as I was reading through 3GPP specifications back in 2018. I think it was release 15 at the time. I started realizing, well, shoot, these carriers are becoming operators of cloud infrastructure. Surely there's a bigger opportunity beyond dial tone. And when I say dial tone, I mean it in the sense of providing voice and data services. If you're moving in that direction, there's something really interesting and a debate to be had around the ability for these networks to actually run applications on the edge as well. And that got me really, really excited. So from my standpoint, I humbly think that 5G is essentially cloud, and that's really, really important. Now, when you think about why the enterprise really matters, there's a few things when you look at what's going on in the enterprise world. The first is many enterprises are turning to their crown jewels called their data. Data is exploding, and I'll talk a little bit about that too today, but they're using their data as a differentiation for how they either operate their businesses, for their manufacturing processes or supply chain, or the experiences that they deliver to their end customers. And you can see here in the middle chart, data is driving Industry 4.0, or the digital transformation journeys that we've been hearing quite a bit about over the last few years. Digital transformation for me is about enterprises moving away from analog to more digital-based processes and using data as an important leverage in that journey. And you can see when you rank these industries, automotive is well up there. This will continue to shift and change over time, but it's really important. And then if you wanted to look at, well, you know, how important is data and how important is the connectivity of that data? About 2 years ago in 2020, just at the height of the pandemic, the FCC started an auction for CBRS spectrum. If you're not familiar with CBRS spectrum, it's publicly available spectrum that has been taken out of spectrum that's been owned by the US Navy. I think it's spectrum from the ranges of 3.5 gigahertz up to about 3.75 gigahertz. And so that amount of spectrum has been opened up for public use, and it's been actually bidded on in 2020 by a number of public entities. That auction alone generated about $4.2 billion, I believe, of spectrum sales. And when you look at the publicly available data, I started doing that myself a few years ago, and I started pulling out some really interesting logos. So you can see these logos here on the right-hand side. So Chevron actually was buying some of its, buying CBRS spectrum, presumably to use it at any one of their facilities. John Deere doing the same. And then of course, there was a number of universities that were buying itself. Today, if you wanted to stand up your own 5G network, you have publicly available spectrum, and assuming there's no license, or sorry, there's no one using the license in your area, you have the ability to actually run your network with access to that license. You could use one of our startups called Freedom Fi, and for a few $100s, buy yourself a Magma-based evolved packet core solution running on plain Jane x86 Intel hardware, and you can go out and buy yourself a RAN kit for about $2,000 to $3,000 and plug that into your spectrum. Now you've got yourself a 5G network. It's that simple. And that simplicity has actually become super disruptive as well when you think about the networking market overall. So from my standpoint, yeah.
Has that ability been there, not in the new spectrums opened up, but before those spectra opened up, would I have had the ability to launch a 4G network just as a guy like I can do now?
There's been a lot that's happened. That's a great question, Brady. There's been a lot that's happened in the market itself. So Project Magma was an effort started by Facebook under their TIP program, the Telecom Infrastructure Project. And that really started to unlock this ability to go build your own. So you can actually now go get open source EPCs. This is called Project Magma from Facebook. That's now been open sourced. And what FreedomFi has done is taken that and hardened it for usage in the enterprise. So prior to that, yes, you could have. The answer is yes, but it would have been very expensive. And unless you had very specialized network expertise, it'd be hard for you to do. Now, FreedomFi has taken that and simplified it. There's still some expertise needed, but it simplified it greatly from what it was to do it in 4G LTE to do it now in 5G. And that's available today. And we've seen other players. In fact, we have two other startups and batches that we've had here before. One called Expeto from batch one, another one called A5G Networks that's doing a distributed core model as well. So there's a lot of new innovation that's happening that's enabling the ability for these enterprises to start really thinking about creating their own private 5G strategies and networks as well. Does that help?
Absolutely.
All right. So I think the enterprise is really a place where there's an opportunity. But before we go deeper into that, if you're as old as I am, you might remember a big company called Sun Microsystems. It was acquired by Oracle a few years ago. There's a gentleman there called John Gage who coined the term, the network is the computer. That's now been recently trademarked by Cloudflare. But what John was suggesting is that the network and the compute should not be silos of operations. And in many respects, they should fuse. Now, if you go back to what I'd said earlier, the carriers are going through and the 5G standards are really pushing towards cloudification or cloud native operations of these networks. And cloud native means that you're actually now starting to really bring compute and connectivity together. In my mind's eye, I don't see them as being distinctly different. I do see them being super connected. Now, why that's so is because that connection is actually touching what these networks are designed to reach, data. Now, I went to do some studies because I wanted to really understand how important is data to us today, right? Your data, my data, the world's data. And I was kind of shocked as I continued digging through the reams and reams of research that are available today. So on the left, if you look at how much data was available in the world today, back in 2010, that was about 2 zettabytes. 1 zettabyte is 1 billion gigabytes. In 2020, that generated, it went from 2 zettabytes up to 64 zettabytes. And according to Statista, which is where I got this data from, their forecast is in the next 2 years, in 2025, that 64 zettabytes will go to 181 zettabytes. So then the question is, well, Jim, why is that super important? Well, that's not data that's just being created for the sake of being created. That's important data that's being used to inform business functions, or it's being used to greater the extent of our livelihoods. For instance, our apps are getting a hell of a lot smarter because the data is enabling them to get a hell of a lot smarter from a consumer standpoint. Or from an enterprise standpoint, I'm getting real-time supply chain data, or I'm getting trusted data from my blockchain around the health of, say, produce that I've picked from a farm and processed and now moved it to retail. All of that is data. And when that data gets accessible and made available real time, now I'm fundamentally not flying blind anymore. I'm flying at an altitude where I can make informed decisions. We have a team that was part of our first batch called Transparent Path, and they've created a blockchain structure that allows growers to start tracking their produce from the farm to processing, right through the supply chain to retail. And why that's important? If there happens to be an outbreak of sorts, or if there happens to be a malfunction of refrigeration on a container, or what have you, something in the supply chain, well, rather than scrapping entire lots of food, you can isolate where the trouble is. Or, and more importantly, you can start notifying people up the line that there's going to be an issue, or an issue needs some attention. That's what data unlocks. And that's why we're seeing this explosive growth of data. It's a huge differentiator for the enterprise. As a developer, what you can now create that harnesses that data, that makes better the livelihoods of enterprises or consumers, is really where the big opportunity is. Now, if you look at how valuable data is at the GDP level, I went and did some more digging, and PwC published a study not too long ago that said, look, AI, which is a function of how you use the data, will potentially contribute about $15.7 trillion to the global economy. In some cases, it could be a boost of about 26% in GDP. Data is not small business. It's the new oil. And so we started looking at that saying, well, shoot, if data is that valuable and 5G networks have the reach from a geo perspective, in any given country around the world today, it's these mobile networks that have the best reach to devices and to people and vehicles and what have you. Well, you bring those things together and you enable computing on those edge networks. Well, that starts to get super, super compelling. I want to give you an example of one of our startups called Innovate Ag that was part of our second batch. And what Innovate Ag does is it uses advanced technologies like LiDAR and soil sensing equipment to properly survey the growth of tree fruits or any sort of tree bearing fruits. It could be apples, it could be cherries, it could be grapes or whatever. They use the LiDAR scans every time they do a scan to be able to track the health of the produce. And they're able to, by doing that, determine, is it getting enough irrigation? Are the apples getting burnt on one side because of too much sun exposure? Is there fire blight in the canopy of that row of crops? So there's a lot of data that it starts to collect. And every scan for a 5-acre block generates about 10 terabytes of data. Imagine moving 10 terabytes of data to a public data center for processing that data. Our 2 functioning field labs that we operate in Snohomish County allows him to offload that data to be pre-processed on the edge and then move the processed data to the cloud. That's exciting. And that's where data, the reach of these networks and the processing capabilities, when you combine those, that's a whole new way of not only building applications, but in meeting the needs of where enterprises are needing to go in their digital transformation journeys.
Question for you, Jim.
Please.
That growth of data graphic you had is wild. It seems like the whole ecosystem around data must be evolving. It must be getting cheaper to generate the data, cheaper to store the data, cheaper to process the data. Is that part of the reason we're seeing that growth? And I guess a second question, is there one area that's lagging behind? Like we can store data super cheaply, that's great, but it's hard to process or it's hard to generate.
I think the hardest thing for those who have the data is how to make sense of it. We have a team in our current batch called Omniscience. They operate at a minimum petabyte scale, right? So when you're at petabytes of data, they can really be helpful. And when I say they operate at petabyte scale, they bring structured, unstructured data into their data lake, and they structure it such that real time you can start to run queries and you can start to run advanced analytics on that data. This is big, Brady, because in many cases you have organizations with significantly large data sets, and it's taken them days, weeks, and sometimes months to get to the analytics that they need to make smart decisions on whatever it is in their business. So storing the data is actually not the challenge. It's making sense of the data, which is where the biggest opportunity is. And it's teams like Omniscience that are really pioneering the ability and really generating the ingenuity and technology to be able to provide that level of service to enterprise customers.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome. Now, I put this together because I wanted to kind of take a step back and look at the macro levels of both the industrial revolutions, from the first industrial revolution of 1784 to where we are today with Industry 4.0 and where we're going with Industry 5.0, and how that parlays to the wireless generations. So I'll start on the wireless side for just a moment. If you all remember, 1G was those big kit-sized phones. I had a car once that had one of those phones embedded in the car as well, or installed in the car, but it was pretty big and pretty bulky, and it was essentially an analog service. When we moved to 2G, we went from analog to digital voice. When we moved from 2G to 3G, we actually started to use data, and not significant data. It wasn't broadband data, it was just data. That's why loading websites was a real chore, and the app ecosystem really didn't fundamentally exist, and good luck trying to stream any video on that. It wasn't designed for it. 4G was. And what lit the market up was the first introduction of the iPhone. Now, there had been other smartphones before the iPhone, but it was really the iPhone that eloquently brought together not just the experience, but more importantly, built the app developer market and the interest around that as well. And so the iPhone really set off this ability for us to have applications and services and do really cool things with our digital lives that spurred not just the mobile app world, but it also spurred cloud computing in many regards as well. In 5G, we go from what was, let's say, DSL service in our home in 4G LTE to fiber service. And that move from the current restrictions that you see in performance today with 4G LTE to what's possible in 5G, fundamentally in the enterprise world, means that you are now in a position to not only harness, but process enormous amounts of data as far as these networks reaches are, and really transform your business in really interesting ways. But here's the sad thing. Our phone bills from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G, the pricing has dropped. There's in the cellular world, the mobile world, there's a metric that they look at called ARPU, the average revenue per unit. At the height of ARPU back in 1993, it was about $76.55. As of the numbers that I had seen in 2019, that had dropped precipitously down to $36.86. And so as these networks have gotten faster and more capable, the cost has dropped. Now, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, and we started off with mechanization in 1784, the first Industrial Revolution, then we went to electrification and Industry 2.0, automation in 3, you can read the rest. But in every one of those generations, the amount of spend on IT and software and robotics and IoT and all the other fun things has exponentially grown. According to Gartner, every year, on average, enterprises worldwide are spending somewhere between $3.3 to $3.5 trillion. I think for 2021, I think it nested out around $3.4 trillion. That's super important. It's not the number. Look at why it's important. And in 2020, if you look at all of the carriers around the world, from the T-Mobiles of here to the Bell Canadas of Canada, or Telefonica in Europe, or NTT Docomo in Japan, if you add all of those up, the big players and the small players, they generated at an industry scale about $1.2 trillion. So there's a lot of money being spent on IT. And when we get to 5G, or sorry, the fifth industrial revolution, which is around personalization, our dependency as a society, not just on some of these cool things like AI and ML, our dependency on data grows exponentially. So the real opportunity that 5G enables and edge computing enables is going to be around how you use the data. And for a developer, think about the opportunity where now you have access to immense amounts of new data for which really your imagination is your limitation in terms of what you could do with that and the new experiences that you can create both in the enterprise context and even in the consumer context as well.
You define edge computing and on the edge.
Edge computing has various different definitions. I think of edge computing as the ability for developers to tap computing nearby their users. Some people refer to edge computing as being able to compute on your mobile phone as an example of an edge. I think of, I'll use this, I'll make this scenario up. Let's say Uber wants to be able to create instances of its applications in various hotspots of cities around the world today because they have a generation of new traffic that the existing service is not able to be able to support. In my case, in my definition, edge computing is the ability to spontaneously create an instance closest to where concentrations of users are that eliminates the latency performance that will inevitably play between where a user is today and where a public instance of their application is, and helps to improve that experience. Now, we have, as I mentioned earlier, 2 field labs. We didn't want to just talk about 5G. We actually wanted to be able to create our own networks as well and get our hands on it. And more importantly, create an environment that our startups could actually deploy what they've built and really test it against these networks and improve the outcomes of their experiences as well. And we happen to have a number of really great partners in our program, starting with Amdocs and Microsoft and Intel and T-Mobile and Ericsson and Nokia and Spirent and Accenture and Avanade. And so together, we started to collaborate on one such use case. Now, this is a promotional video, but it really helps to stitch together everything that I just shared. So with that, I'll take a moment and just play a quick video for you all to see a scenario in action. All right, so what you saw there was everything I just talked about stitched together. It was an application, in this case, Innovate Ag, based out of Walla Walla, Washington, using that sophisticated equipment. In this case, we actually used a drone that was powered by functions that are running in Azure, and real-time stitching images that were collected by the drone, flying at 4K, processed on site, moved the relevant data from the processed data up to the Azure cloud. And right there, the grower was seeing real-time insights into how his or her crop, in this case, Nate, his crop was doing. Just last summer alone, by using soil sensing IoT sensors, just a handful of them, in a weather station, the LiDAR scans with soil sensing and that technology, we saved or helped to save Nate about 50% of his water consumption. What we uncovered was that Nate was over irrigating his crops. And that might sound okay to us who are not growers. And that's actually pretty bad for the tree fruits themselves. The trees, when over irrigated, actually exposes them to more disease. And the quality of the crops, in his case, Honeycrisp apples and Cosmic Crep apples, the quality actually diminishes. And if the quality diminishes, he can't command top dollar for his fruit. You see, there's industries out there just like Nate's in agriculture, but also in manufacturing and supply chains and healthcare, where you have people that are absolutely dialed in and know exactly how to run their businesses. In this case with Nate, his sense of, let me see how irrigated my field is would walk out and kick the dirt and see, is it moist underneath? Well, in his particular case, his soil structure wasn't such that it would give him a really good indicator. It was only because of these IoT sensors and the ability to then layer on additional data that was generated, where we're able to give him a complete view of the health of his crops. So just in one growing season, we not only helped him reduce his water consumption by 50%, I think even by the end of the summer, he was getting close to about 3/4 of reduction in water consumption. He also had his best year. And that's all, my friends, because of data. So when you look at the drones flying around, you think that's really cool. And you think about, wow, there's a 5G network over that's really cool. And there's this really cool server that's processing all that data. We've got a really cool startup like Innovate Ag that's doing some cool stuff. Yeah, it's all cool. But the impact that it's creating for the enterprise, in this case for Nate, is fundamental. And that's all because of the data. All of that stuff working in concert is what helped to create a better outcome for Nate last year in his crop yields. And it was a great demonstration of the vision that John Gage had from Sun Microsystems back in the early 80s around the network as the computer. See, we never demarked the lines in that network at all about what is the 5G network or what is the server. It all just sort of blended together. And for Innovate Ag, they were just accessing compute resources nearby to be able to process an immense amount of data without having to move that. Now, in Steve Mantle's case, this farm isn't what he sees when he drives out to Montana or Idaho or all across Washington State and down into Oregon State to support his customers. There's absolutely zero connectivity. Steve himself has had to literally resort to building a mobile data center in the same trailer that he parks his side-by-side in as he goes from field to field. That's the extent that he's had to go to be able to deliver on the value that he's promised his customers. Now, with this possibility, we're showing that 5G is bigger than connectivity, because it is. It's the proximity of these networks, it's the speed of the networks, and it's the ability to actually now bring together computing into these networks that makes it a truly powerful combination.
That was a great demonstration and a kind of a great case study. And it struck me when I was watching it that IoT sensing and edge compute it's about omniscience, right? It's if you could know everything, how would that change your business? And it feels like it starts to become an issue of creativity. Are you creative enough to ask the right questions now that you have the ability to answer them? If you can come up with a question and get the right sensor, you can know a scale of data that is astounding. And what's that going to do for your business?
Right. Now, you asked a great question about the importance of data earlier, Brady. Here's something where we're not taking one source of data, we're taking multiple sources of data and creating an experience, a heat map, if you will, for the grower so that he or she can make informed decisions on outcomes that they want to drive for their crop. And that's where data, when stitched together, is super truly powerful. And that was one of many use cases that we're exploring at our own farms and really starting to not only demonstrate the viability of this crazy idea that computing and network connectivity fusing together could create something truly transformative. Here's how we're actually helping enterprises, in this case, state, on uncovering that data to his advantage. And this is happening everywhere. So then the question becomes, well, why isn't every carrier doing this? And in many cases, there is a lot of work happening. So Microsoft, as you've probably seen, has signed a strategic partnership with AT&T, and they're working on something very similar to this concept. And Verizon's done some things as well with Microsoft, but also signed a deal with AWS. There is activity that's happening in the ecosystem that is bringing this vision of compute and networks together. We think it's an opportunity for the carriers to not take the 4G LTE playbook and think it's going to work in 5G, but actually create their new 5G playbook, a playbook that forces them to think differently, a playbook that says, hey, my network is greater than the connectivity it provides. My network has the reach of no other network on the planet, and I'd like to turn that reach into something that developers could tap into and create these really cool experiences. And for a developer, it should be seamless. You have to do nothing on your side other than say, hey, I want my application to dynamically go and blow up in the edge wherever it's needed. I think of the edge as brain synapses, right? It's not like your application needs to run on the edge everywhere all day long, every day. That's actually not reality. The reality is you've got an application that runs in a hosted environment. Maybe it's an Azure environment or a hybrid environment if you're in the enterprise, or your private environment, but it has this ability to go plug into the edge. And that ability to plug into the edge for processing data and creating the computing resources needed to deliver near real time, if not in some cases real time experiences, is truly powerful, truly transformative, and I think is going to be a foundational component to what we see with the fifth industrial revolution. Applications drive platform value. Of my almost 14 years at Microsoft, it was a truly transformative experience professionally for me because I saw how important platforms are, whether it was Windows on our PCs, Windows Server on servers, Dynamics, Xbox, now Azure. I saw how transformative it was. And I saw when we got it wrong too. If you remember back in the early days, Windows Phone went through a bit of a reboot with Windows Phone 7. And I will take this to my grave. Windows Phone operating system was one of the better operating systems at the time. We lacked the app ecosystem. And unfortunately, didn't really have enough of that momentum to have Windows Phone be a viable platform for developers organically to create applications on top of. We saw all of that happening in iOS, obviously, and then of course, Android as well. Now, applications is what drives and pulls through the platforms, whether it's your application running on a public cloud, like in Azure, or your application running on your mobile phone. If your mobile phone had no apps on it, it would be just like what Windows Phone was, a fairly cool device, but really doesn't have much functionality beyond a great camera and the ability to make phone calls. And so applications are really, really important. And we didn't see any work really being done in that world as it relates to 5G and edge computing. And that was the reason why we felt it was really important to build the 5G Open Innovation Lab as a place for those innovators that are looking to explore the capabilities of 5G and edge coming together in the context of where the enterprises are going and are creating new capabilities. We wanted to build that ecosystem, and that's what the lab was built for. And the third thing is, and something, Brady, that we've talked about throughout today's session, it's really all about the enterprise. We're big believers that the enterprise is where the biggest opportunity is. And hopefully throughout today's presentation, I was able to really impress that point. Now, as a developer, the things that you're going to probably want to take away from this is, okay, so what is really the opportunity, Jim? Well, the biggest opportunity in my mind is data. Data is the new oil. And it doesn't matter where you select your data from or how you cultivate your data, how you make sense of that data is as important as the acquisition of the data and storing the data itself. But enterprises are increasingly turning their attention to the data they have and harnessing that data in ways that they can create either new business processes or brand new experiences or differentiation of their services and products to the market. I think edge computing is going to be fairly significant. And from a developer standpoint, it's going to force you to think differently. It's going to force you to think differently because in today's developer model, you're building applications that will run in availability zones. Well, what if those availability zones went from 1 to 100? And so the edge is, we're early innings on that. But it's going to be an opportunity for us to really think differently about how do we use resources that are available on this edge? And what new experiences can I light up on behalf of my customers, irrespective of them being enterprise or them being consumers? The last thing that I'm super excited about, and something we're tracking quite closely ourselves, is where private 5G is going today. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of market data suggests that it's a growing market. The last report that I had seen suggested the CAGR is a 48% CAGR year on year. So there's a lot of interest, and I think we're past the kicking the tires world in private 5G, that it's going to become really important. Why private 5G is important for developers: as enterprises look to and deploy cellular connectivity to their sites, whether it's in warehousing, oil rigs, entire hospitals, campuses, behind that connectivity will be computing. And so the context of opportunity that I talked about in edge computing applies to the private 5G market as well. So those are the big developer opportunities that I see with 5G. I think 5G and edge is a significantly wonderful enabler. We've built an entire ecosystem with partnerships and 71 teams to go after that opportunity and continue bringing on some really interesting teams to explore where that possibility is. And so with that, that was all I had. I'll turn it over, Brady, to yourself for any questions.
That was great, Jim. I love every time we talk about 5G, I feel like I have just read a large book, and I really appreciate you sharing all that.
Sure.
I'd love for you to plug the 5G Lab. If you could tell us more kind of about what you do, what the 5G Lab does, how you support your companies, in case there's anybody out there who's looking for some more support.
Sure. Yeah, so the 5G Open Innovation Lab is an open innovation program. We're not an accelerator, not an incubator. We work with teams that range from Series Seed to Series C. Of the 71 teams that we've had across 5 batches, they've all raised collectively just north of $1 billion in venture, about $780 million in pre-program funding and about $300 and change million in post-program funding. So we're a program that doesn't take any equity. We don't ask for any fees. We're entirely funded by our partners, of which we have 14. Those include Microsoft and Intel and T-Mobile and Dell and VMware, Accenture, Avanade, Spirent, Ericsson, Nokia, GAF. These are all partners that are either platform enablers, like a Microsoft or Intel or a T-Mobile, or they're enterprise customers. We have announced our partnership with CNH, which is a producer of large, heavy industrial equipment. These are enterprises that are saying, look, the connectivity and the computing on the edge is going to transform my business. I know how to build tractors. I don't know really how to go find the right startups in that world. So we use our program. We run 2 batches a year as a way to bring some of those really cool innovators, regardless of what stage they're at, to get exposure to our partners. And our program, like I said, is not an accelerator incubator program. So we don't have any cookbook or any sort of set programming. When the founders come into our program, they set their own direction. They come to the table with a set of outcomes that they want to drive, and it's our partners who then engage around those outcomes, around areas that they're mutually benefiting from.
Very impressive. I don't know if you have a list of all your partners right off a screen, but getting all of those off the top of your head is incredible, by the way.
Thank you.
So I'd love to hear some specific examples, a company that you have worked with and how they've interacted with a partner, kind of
Sure.
where the rubber meets the road.
Sure, there's several, but one that's well documented, if you do a Google search or a Bing search on Halo Car and T-Mobile, there's a lot of documentation about that one. But Halo Car is actually rethinking our rental car experience. They're a fully autonomous operation for a car. They're now trialing and piloting in Las Vegas. But imagine, if you will, you're wanting to either rent a vehicle for a little bit of time, well, rent a vehicle. Let's just start there. I don't want to go too far. So you want to rent a vehicle. In today's world, you get off your airplane or you go to a rental site and you pick up your car. In a Halo world, you call the Halo and it gets teleoperated to where you're at. So there is a driver somewhere in the city that picks up a vehicle for you and teleoperates it with nobody in the car to where you are. And once you're in that vehicle, you take control of it and you drive wherever you need to drive. And once you're done with it, get out and it goes off and parks and waits for its next ride. They're trialing, as I mentioned, in Las Vegas. They worked very, very closely with T-Mobile. You can imagine when you're teleoperating a vehicle, the importance of the network and constant connectivity and this ability to move large amounts of data across the network. to safely operate that vehicle. And so T-Mobile and Halo Car have really worked closely together on that scenario. And then I can go on with other use cases of other teams that are collaborating. Pano, as an example, is one of our teams that's also collaborating with T-Mobile. They are in the early fire detection for wildfire world, and so there's some really cool work that's happening there. I don't want to spill too much on that, but there's a lot of really cool use cases. We have a saying in our program, it's called GSD. It's get, bleep, done. We're really focused on outcomes. We're really focused on not just working with a bunch of really cool startups and great enterprise partners. We really want to bring founders and our enterprise partners together to focus on use cases that really matter and make that all successful together. And so that's what our program was designed to do. And it's led to some really great outcomes like the stories I just shared.
Yeah, I saw a demo from Pano at your launch party, and that's incredible tech.
Yeah, we have Pano, we have Tactile, which you probably also saw a demo of. Tactile is doing some amazing work, Dirk and his team here in Seattle, with all of our partners. There's some really cool things that's possible in this world.
And then on the technical side, so Halo, that couldn't have run on 4G because they wouldn't have been able to move data quickly enough. They would have had, the latency would be slow, the downtime would be too much, all of the above.
Yes, and then the quality of the connectivity is not as strong as what it could be in 5G.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you were going to start a 5G related company, what problem would you be going after?
That's a great question. So the underpinning of whatever I would start would focus on data, not the acquisition. Well, it would be the combination of the acquisition, the processing of data. Yeah, I think it would be more app-based. But there's a ton of really big problems that are going to be solved. I'll give you an example. One of our partners called Avanade was a joint venture that was initiated by Microsoft and Accenture, I think, over 22 years ago. Avanade was a 50-50 joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft, as I mentioned, and they have over thousands of enterprise customers across all ranges everywhere in the world. And we had a chat with them just as COVID was starting to really come into market. And then we have had several chats with them since COVID has kind of run its course to where we are today. And the one thing that was really interesting, because they sit on the front lines with enterprise customers, the one thing that we saw that was really interesting is that as the pandemic really started to take hold at a global level, it caught a lot of enterprises off guard. They really did not have the automation or the systems in place to be able to work remotely or to deliver their services or appease their customer needs remotely. Some of them, really struggled on getting around that. Most of their Avanade customers actually used COVID as an opportunity to really double down. And in fact, if you look at a study that was published by IDC last summer, actually last winter, they forecasted that $6.8 trillion was being spent by enterprises on digital transformation investments. That's a phenomenal amount of dollars if you think of the Gartner $3.4 trillion being spent. So if I were to go start a startup, it would be app-based, obviously. It would be focused on the enterprise, and data would be core to the value. Now, you could apply that motion in any sort of autonomous capabilities. You could apply that in supply chain. There's lots of areas where enterprises are saying, we got to move away from manual. We got to start looking at how do we harness this data to make our workers a lot more productive and our processes a lot more productive. And ultimately, in some cases, actually a lot more automated. There's a really interesting video. If you do a search on YouTube, do a search for automation and automotive in China, there's a manufacturer, an OEM manufacturer in China, where 90% of the production of the vehicle is done by machines. Only 10% of the production is actually done by humans. That's where the world is going. And that's where I get really excited about teams that are actually chipping away at that level of innovation.
Yeah. So as you know, you helped to get this thing done. We have a 5G network here in the hardware incubator at CoMotion Labs. And a question I asked you one time is, when you're finding companies to bring in, do folks know that they are 5G companies, or do some people need to learn that they are 5G companies?
Right. So one of the big lessons that I learned in running Microsoft for Startups, because I was the guy with my brilliant team bringing the Microsoft flag into Y Combinator and 500 Startups and Techstars and all these great incubators and accelerators around the US and Canada. The startups themselves don't identify with, I'm a cloud company. They identify themselves as, I'm a widget company, right? Whatever that widget is. They could be a SaaS play, they could be an IoT play, they could be a robotics play. The cloud is an enabler. So for all of our teams, we have a set of teams that are building 5G radios, 5G mesh systems, millimeter wave. So those companies identify truly as 5G because they're building capabilities, whether it's hardware or software based, specifically for 5G networks. But a vast majority of our teams don't assimilate themselves to I'm a 5G startup or I'm an edge startup. They're a widget startup on whatever they're doing. And an edge in 5G, just like what public cloud computing was or hyperscale computing is really just an enabler. And that was a big lesson I learned at my time at Microsoft, because we thought really, when we did developer evangelism, that we wanted to push our platforms. The platform is the enabler, it's the engine, yes. It's not what people are building capabilities for. There's an old adage, Brady, you probably remember this one, which is no one buys a 3/8 drill bit, they buy a hole in the wall. Right? And that's what edge is, that's what connectivity is, that's what cloud computing is, that's what the operating system on our phones are. It's the enabler.
I love that. Last bit, how do people get a hold of you? Are you recruiting for more companies? Are you onboarding?
Absolutely. Yes, we're actually in the process of narrowing down our selection for batch 6 and starting interviews. Every team that we invite into an interview actually interviews not just with us, they interview with 14 of our partners. And it's not like a Spanish Inquisition. It's actually really collaborative, fun discussion that founders get to have with our partners, and likewise. And our partners get a chance to get a deeper understanding of what the startup is building capability-wise, and the founders have a chance to really assess, is this program the right fit for them? So we're in the process of narrowing that down. Our next batch actually starts on September 12th of this year. We'll make decisions on batch 6 here near the end of June. So if you are interested, if you go to the 5GUILab.com site, under the About, there's a link at the bottom, and you can apply for the program there. Again, we take teams that are seed stage all the way up to Series C. The Series C teams and bigger teams, they've raised a lot of capital, and that's fantastic. And they've got the right amount of resources to really keep up with and go real hard with our partners around go-to-market or engineering engagements and such like that. So we really like to see some teams that are super early with promising prospects and solving real problems, but also work with a set of teams that are a little later as well, because they have the means to be able to really engage deeply with our partners.
Sure. Yeah, anybody that's listening, can't recommend Jim's program enough. No equity, no IP, just like CoMotion Labs, we take that seriously. We love finding folks in the ecosystem that are about helping startups, and Jim is very much in that camp. Big thank you, Jim, for coming on here today and sharing your vast knowledge of 5G, no matter how much you try to downplay it.
Thank you.
Super useful, so much fun to learn about these new technologies coming online that are going to have a huge impact on us going forward. So thank you. Also, a big thank you to Macy McGovern for talking about CDL's new stream around advanced manufacturing. If you didn't catch her email or Jim's email and you have mine, reach out to me. Happy to plug you folks in. Thank you to everybody who attended today and the other hardware talks throughout this spring. And thank you to the folks on the back end, Rick, who handles the video switching, Caroline, who puts this on. Super appreciative for everybody. We look forward to talking to you soon in the fall for a new round of Friday Fundamentals. And everybody, have a great summer.